Okay, well, Rocky, as we were just saying before everybody joined us, um, we actually first met in the Renaissance pleasure palaces in Rome. Um, so this
I was a
really
waiter.
takes.
I was a waiter there, Bonnie.
Well, we before COVID, our NSU Art Museum had a great patron travel program, and we started our travel in Rome, and I had asked all of my friends who are with the Friends of the Uffizi and Friends of Florence, who would be a great guide, highly educated and scholar of this period to take us through. And they all independently said you. And so we coordinated, and you threw out right away, oh, I do this great tour of the Renaissance pleasure palaces. And I didn't even know there were any. So I thought that would be really great. And on top of that, you got us into the Villa Farnesina. I hope I said that right?
Yeah,
Farnesina.
perfectly. Yeah.
When it was closed to the public. So we got to spend about 2 hours with you exploring the murals and this entire wonderful place. So, and that was how we first met. So we thought that with Valentine's Day coming up, what a perfect theme to present in our newest installment of your lectures and live virtual tours of the Renaissance. So I am now going to turn it over to you, Rocky. And I know that there's a very full talk, and I'm looking forward to revisiting these incredible Renaissance pleasure palaces. Thanks.
Thank you, Bonnie. It's really always a pleasure to be with you, with your organization as well. And in fact, we were kind of reminiscing about our first encounter. Bonnie said, I met you at a pleasure palace. And Bonnie, my wife is listening. But it really is. And I remember when I spoke to Bonnie for the first time, we were talking about different options. And, obviously it was a rather experienced crowd coming from NSU. And so we were looking for something kind of off the beaten track, but obviously to the same level of artistic importance that a place like the Vatican museums or other places in Rome might offer. And immediately I proposed this notion of visiting the two kind of major Renaissance pleasure palaces of Rome. And it's important to remember. I mean, it's a lot of fun to talk about this, and as Bonnie mentioned, obviously it's a perfectly appropriate theme considering the proximity now of Valentine's Day. But it's also very much a part of the identity of the Renaissance, because the Renaissance is the rebirth of classical Greek and Roman culture. And one of the traditions that came back in Rome, first of all, was this revival of the construction and use of suburban pleasure palaces, right? Sub meaning outside, urb meaning city. And this was a tradition that went all the way back to ancient Rome, where most Roman aristocrats would in fact enjoy a city dwelling, a domus as they were called, but to get away from the stresses and the pressures of urban life would also retreat to their country homes, their vacation homes, their getaway homes, which are called villas, V-I-L-L-A. And I want you to realize that when we use the term villa today, most people are implying the actual building, right? When in reality, what the Romans and what Renaissance Romans also meant by the villa was actually the building and its surrounding property. It was something that was meant to be enjoyed comprehensively, all at the same time. And really, the first or sort of seminal pleasure palace in ancient Rome is the one that you're looking at right now. Right today, it's referred to as the Villa Farnesina. But when it was built at the beginning of the 16th century, it was instead known as the Villa Chigi, because the original owner, the patron of its construction and decoration, was a gentleman named Agostino Chigi. His self-given nickname, Il Magnifico, not to be confused with Lorenzo de' Medici, who also referred to himself as Il Magnifico. And so I think at a certain point, if you are of the economic and political and social stature that it was okay to just start referring to yourself as Il Magnifico. Chigi was the banker to Pope Julius II, and certain historians have proposed that he may have been the wealthiest person on earth at the beginning of the 16th century. And so what he decided to do was to exploit some of his wealth by, in fact, having a building constructed suburb outside the city of Rome. In fact, Bonnie and those of you who were with me that day may remember we crossed across the Tiber River just to the other side, to the Lungo Tevere Martio, as it's called. So they were outside the city. The idea of, again, escaping from the chaos of city living, and to employ this Sienese architect by the name of Baldassare Peruzzi to design a building whose primary and almost exclusive purpose was, in fact, debauchery and delectation. Right? And so when I'm trying to define this building to my undergraduates, I age myself in the process, but I think perhaps the most fitting kind of analogy that I can make is that the reputation of this particular building was very much similar to the reputation of a place called the Playboy Mansion. If you remember back to the 1960s and 70s and 80s, this was a place that everyone wanted to get into, that was notorious for its celebrations, for its excess, again, for its hedonism as well. And so the idea that everything about it was meant to sort of nurture and kind of was conducive to this particular type of atmosphere. Now, before I forget, the reason they call it the Farnesina is because in later centuries, the building was sold to the Farnese family, whose palace is just across the river. And so the Farnese wanted to make this essentially their dependance, or their in-law apartment. And so it became the Little Farnese Villa, right? Not to be confused with their major palazzo on the other side. And the structure, you can see, essentially consists of the main body. Let me put my little red dot function on for my cursor. The main body, and then the two wings that you see to the left and the right. And I want you to remember that the arcade here, these arches that you see, were originally open. Okay? The glass was put in later for conservation reasons. And originally there was a loggia that welcomed visitors to the actual structure. And if the front of the building is handsome, the backside is just as handsome. And in fact, it opens up into this beautiful garden space. And in fact, if I remember correctly, Bonnie, I think we actually were allowed access into the gardens as well, which are usually off limits to the general public. Today, if you were to visit the Farnesina, you would actually enter through this door. But originally, this was the back door of the structure. It's quite simple but elegant in its design. Two stories that are articulated with these Doric order pilasters. And if you look carefully, that sort of rough texture that you see is not any kind of treatment. It's simply the texture of the bricks that is underneath. So the building is made entirely of brick, which is then stuccoed over to give the impression there of the architecture that you actually see. And then above this rather playful frieze with these stuccoed little putti playing with these garlands as well. And so the idea of being embedded out in nature, the green in the front, the green in the back, the loggia, a kind of transitional space, and then once a visitor walked through the main hall, out into the garden area as well. In fact, it's always helpful to look at floor plans of these buildings to get a true sense of how they were arranged. So that if you were, in fact, a guest at one of the famous celebrations, you'd walk in through the front door. Here is that loggia that we call the Loggia of Psyche. And originally, the space beyond it was also rectangular in shape. Right? This wall that you see now dividing it was actually a later addition, but this was the Great Hall. So this is where the great banquets and festivities would usually take place. And this hall had a loggia in front of it, and what was originally a loggia to the side of it as well. And then the staircase that leads up to the first floor. Very simple, but yet at the same time, very elegant design. And when you walk through that front door, this is the first space that you would see, right? The so-called Loggia of Psyche. The artists who were responsible for its decoration all came from the bottega of the great Raphael, as in the Raphael, who, remember, at exactly the same time was busy over at the Villa Belvedere in the Apostolic Palace over at St. Peter's at the Vatican, because he was decorating the apartments of Pope Julius II. So if the patron of this building was the banker to the Pope honored his banker by allowing his best artist, Raphael, who, according to many at the time, was even superior to Michelangelo, to decorate the building that was being built by his banker. Now, Raphael did contribute to some of this decoration, but it really was this gesture of gratitude and of respect towards his banker to have all of these artists actually come over and decorate the villa itself. In fact, interesting that when you look up at the vault of the loggia, so those arches that I showed you a minute ago are over here to the right-hand side. Again, now they're glassed up, but originally were entirely open. And when you look up at the ceiling of the loggia, this beautiful fictive kind of pergola that has been painted over. So the loggia, which is this sort of open, semi-closed space, was really meant to be a kind of transitional space between the outdoor and indoor world. And that outdoor theme is carried over in the beautiful articulation of this fictive pergola with these fruit and vegetable filled garlands that you see, sustaining two massive faux tapestries in the center, and then the remaining spaces all filled with figurative art. But here's the interesting thing, right? Let us pretend that we are, in fact, guests at the Villa Chigi, as it was originally called, at the beginning of the 16th century. You walk through the front door, there are waiters walking around with trays of champagne and little tartines that we're eating as well. And you're looking around. You don't know anyone, right? So you're admiring the artwork around you to try to get a sense of where you are and who your host might actually be. And the first thing you notice is that the prominent display of the coat of arms here is not the coat of arms of your patron, but is instead the coat of arms of the then reigning Pope, Julius II. And so this is a nod on the part of the patron to the Pope, but it's also a display of the fact that the patron is what you would call a made man. In other words, he's obviously the right-hand man of perhaps the most powerful man in Europe at the time, and that is Pope Julius II. So there are many layers to this. I mean, it's not just the debauchery and the delectation. There's also a kind of power move here on the part of the patron to show exactly who he is and how, in a way, I guess the hedonism is sort of condoned, paradoxically enough, by the head of the Christian world. Right? Now, the subject matter of the painting, it's telling a story which comes out of a book called The Golden Ass. The Golden Ass was written by an author named Apuleius, and it was the most popular piece of literature at the beginning of the 16th century because it had only been recently rediscovered. Some of you may know the story. I'm not going to go through the entirety of it in all the different scenes because we'll be here until tomorrow morning. It's quite elaborate. But the gist of it is that Psyche, spelled Psyche, was a very beautiful woman. So beautiful that she was actually worshipped by men. And the fact that men were worshiping her made Venus, we'll use their Roman names, the goddess of love and beauty, quite jealous. And so Venus decided to punish Psyche by having her marry the most vile man in the world. And in order to do this, she needed the help of her son, Cupid. So here is Venus. Now, I want you also to realize something. I'll get so caught up in kind of telling you the story that we sort of forget to actually focus on the imagery that we're looking at, right? That body type, this is not Michelangelo, right? This is not a man's body with feminine details attached. This is essentially the quintessential ideal female form for the 16th century. It is a bit more generous than how we would define ideal female beauty today, but that's clearly an attempt at kind of an erotic display of feminine beauty. And so the story is Venus pointing to Psyche and telling Cupid, look, I want you to hit her with a dart so that she'll fall in love with the world's most ugly man. All right. This is the main scene in the pendentive space. And you can see the beauty of all of this vegetal decoration around. What happens is that instead of following his mother's orders, Cupid is smitten with Psyche. And so Bonnie was talking about an appropriate theme for Valentine's Day. This is one of the great love stories of classical mythology. And immediately Cupid runs to essentially inform the three graces that you see here of Psyche's beauty. And so you see him pointing down saying, isn't she beautiful? Now, you're not seeing Psyche down below because we're fairly certain that once upon a time, there were actually tapestries on the walls the lower walls that complemented what was happening up above. And so the idea is the kind of celestial field representing Olympus and the Olympian gods, but then what was happening here on earth represented instead on tapestries that were decorating the walls. Now, again, these graces, these ideal female forms painted by the workshop of Raphael, and it has been proposed by some that the female with her back to us is actually a work by Raphael himself. The modeling that you see here is much more sophisticated than it is on the other two. And perhaps the maestro himself, one day while checking in to see how things were going, and essentially honoring his patron by actually painting the figure in on the scene. Right? Now, what happens? Here we have Venus. Right? Now I'm showing them to you in order. We're going left to right, technically speaking. And there's Venus in her typical Venus pudica pose, left hand over her pubis, although her right hand not covering her breasts. Again, that ideal female form. And so clearly this notion of erotic delectation is one that will be fairly common in this building if you're trying to get, again, a sense of where you are and what is going to happen. And she's complaining to Ceres, the goddess of agriculture. You see the grain there making up her crown, and Juno, who is the wife of Jupiter, her Greek name, Hera. And you can almost imagine Venus saying, who the hell does she think she is, right? With men worshiping her there on Earth. And so Venus decides that she's taken this right to the top. And so in the next scene, here she is on her chariot, drawn by doves. You see that? And she's going all the way to the corner office to complain to the most important of the gods, whose name, of course, was Zeus. And she's complaining, of course, of this veneration of a mortal. And, you know, the figure of Venus in this particular scene is really one of the most beautiful, I think, that you will see in the entire history of art. And it is, again, we're at the beginning of the 16th century, so it is a breath of fresh air to see artists treating femininity with a true sensitivity to female beauty. Consider at this time, Michelangelo's paradigm of art, again, of these big muscular forms, had pretty much overridden just about every artist except for Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael, who were still expressing feminine beauty in their own particularly sensitive way. And so you see her there, and you see Zeus with his left leg, if you haven't noticed it, sort of draped over the top of his symbolic eagle. The symbol of Zeus is, in fact, the eagle. Right? Now we turn the corner, and here we have Mercury. Right? So again, you're probably on your second or third glass of champagne at this point, and you look up at the vault. You've been reading the scenes because you've been figuring out the story, because everyone knew the story of Cupid and Psyche. And what you have now is just full-on frontal male nudity, right? And this is not that idealized nudity that allows us to look at Michelangelo's figures on the Sistine ceiling, to look at his David and not blush, because they're so perfect that you almost overlook the fact that they're not wearing clothes. This figure is muscular and idealized, but at the same time, there's a naturalism to it that makes it almost erotic art in that sense. It's not sublimated eroticism. It's pretty explicit as he throws his arms up and his genitalia is entirely exposed. Now, remember, you're on your second or third drink. You're looking at the figure saying, that's a little raw in its image. And then you follow Mercury's left hand up into the garland. And right here, not too hidden away, is a rather explicit image of a large zucchini with a bulbous end to which an eggplant is superimposed and which is cracking open the fig that you see there. And now, you think maybe you're seeing things, but you realize you're not, because ultimately the artwork here is kind of setting the tone again for how this evening is most likely going to progress. All right, so the gist of the story is Cupid does not see his mother's orders through. What happens is he takes Psyche, steals her away. The two of them live in absolute bliss in this castle, in this beautiful palace. They have this great affair, both physical and emotional. But the problem is, the one condition that Cupid imposes is that she can never look at him. He does not want her to know that he is a god. And so they get along quite well until she tells her sisters how happy she is, but that she can never actually look at her groom. When her sisters hear this, and there's a kind of Cinderella twist to the story, they immediately say, well, he probably doesn't want you to look at him because he's probably hideous. And in fact, he should probably be killed because he's a completely grotesque being. And so the story goes that one night after an intense session of lovemaking, she decides to, in fact, take her sister's advice. And so she goes into the bedchamber with an oil lamp to look upon him and a razor with which to cut his throat. And the story goes that when she looks upon Cupid, she's so startled by his beauty that she spills a little bit of the hot oil on him. He suddenly wakes up, realizes that she's broken a promise, and flees. And at this point, a common leitmotif in classical Greek literature, she, Psyche, needs to perform a series of nearly impossible tasks in order to redeem herself. And in fact, the image that you're looking at right now was one of them. She needed to go down into Hades, right, into the underworld, and to retrieve a jar of beauty from Persephone, who we're going to be talking about, excuse me, a little bit later on. And here you can see she's being carried up victoriously by these little putti figures that you see. Right? Then we have Cupid, who's gone up to see Zeus and see if we can fix things as well. In the story, there is no mention of a kiss between the two of them, but clearly it is both erotic and homoerotic themed enjoyment that will be happening inside of the building. And so you can see Cupid here standing with the older, very muscular figure of Jupiter leaning over and delivering a kiss. There's the eagle again with the lightning bolts in his mouth. Look at the mushrooms, by the way, as well. It's amazing just how detailed all of this image actually is, right? Well, what happens? They decide that they're all going to live happily ever after. And so here's an image of our friend Mercury, who we saw earlier on the other side, who is now accompanying Psyche up to Olympus because all's well that ends well, as the story goes. And in fact, the two large rectangular faux tapestries on the ceiling represent here the Council of the Gods. So this is where essentially all of the Olympian gods met to decide the fate of Cupid and Psyche. What should we do? And so you see Psyche pleading his case. You see you see Cupid pleading his case. You see Venus pleading hers. There's Zeus listening attentively. You have Neptune. You have Pluto. You have Minerva. You have all the gods listening in. And finally, they decide that nothing can stand in the way of true love. And so the story ends happily ever after with the wedding feast that you see here of Cupid lying on the couch with Psyche right next to him and all of the Olympians there around as well. Now, again, it's so easy to kind of overlook the fact that this image was probably very much similar to the activity or the event that would be happening in the next room, if you get my drift. In other words, it's easy to just insert this into the narrative, the story that I'm telling you about Cupid and Psyche, and the fact that it all ended happily ever after. But in many ways, again, the artwork was a direct reflection of the actual activity that was taking place inside of the building. Right? And if you look carefully at the scene, you'll see that this looks like one hell of a party. In fact, one of the most celebrated of the dinners that Agostino Chigi hosted was entirely served on golden dishware. Everything was made of gold, the forks, knives, plates, everything else. And upon completion of dinner, all of the guests were invited to walk over to the bank of the Tiber River and to just throw their dishware into the river. But Chigi was so rich, he could actually, have golden dishware as disposable dishware. What they didn't know is that Chigi had actually planted all of his servants at the bottom of the bank of the river. And as the plates came flying over, they were actually catching them with nets because rich, yes, foolish, no. And there's no reason to throw away perfectly good gold. These are the kind of legends that came out of this particular building and the events that actually happened inside. So remember, you're just in the first room. You haven't even gone into the actual banqueting room yet. And when you progress into the next space, you enter into what we still call the Loggia of Galatea, even though the room is no longer a loggia. Okay, the archways that you see here on the right-hand side of your screen have been since closed up. They've been walled up. But originally, this would have been another sort of indoor-outdoor space. And the artwork here, at least the ceiling decoration, was largely executed by the architect of the building, whose name was Baldassare Peruzzi as well. And the entirety of the program here, I think you can probably make out, Sagittarius and Capricorn and the different zodiacal symbols, technically. There's Leo over here. These are Gemini. I'm not big into horoscopes and astrology per se, but what this entire ceiling program depicts is, in fact, the horoscope of Agostino Chigi, the time, the day, the year that he was actually born. Now, consider that technically astrology was against church belief. I mean, only God determined what happens, not the stars. But we're in a building that was largely, sponsored by the Pope, and clearly there is a strong interest in astrology. And remember that usually when popes were elected in office, the first thing they did was to have their horoscopes read to, in fact, determine how their papacies would go in the end. And so, again, clearly, this kind of setting is the perfect place to introduce the rather playful and erotic artwork depicting astrological themes. And in fact, on the wall here, right, you may recognize above the image here of Icarus falling from the sky with his father Daedalus. But more importantly, the two large rectangular frescoes that you see of Polyphemus, the Cyclops, to the left, and of Galatea, the nymph, to the right. Well, the painting of the Cyclops was done by a very important Venetian artist, then living in Rome, by the name of Sebastiano del Piombo. Right, Piombo, which is lead. He was the seal keeper of papal documents later on. But he was very, very close to Michelangelo for a long time. I mean, he was just a Cinco fan in regards to Michelangelo, constantly reminding Michelangelo that he was the greatest. And it's interesting to see how different his style is. Can you see this kind of blurry quality? The Venetians weren't into that same linear kind of draftsman-based art that the Central Italians like Michelangelo and Leonardo and Raphael were. Much softer brush stroke, the palette much brighter. It's about color and light and shadow. And technically, the subject is related to the painting next door, because Polyphemus, in fact, had kidnapped the nymph Galatea, who you see represented here. And when he caught Galatea with her lover Attis, crushed her lover Attis by hurling a huge boulder atop of him and killing him. This painting, let me just go back, show you where it is. To the right-hand side of it, depicts the nymph. We call this the sort of apotheosis of Galatea. There's no real storyline here. A lot of people thought that she was being whisked away and saved, but that's actually not the case. When I was an undergraduate studying in Italy back in 1993 and 1994, this was one of the most celebrated paintings in Rome. When you went to Rome, you had to see the Colosseum, you had to see the Sistine Chapel, you had to see Michelangelo's statue of Moses, and you needed to go over to the Farnesina to see Raphael's Galatea. There are still signs in the area. You can walk from the Vatican, from St. Peter's Square to the Farnesina, about 20 minutes. It's a pretty short walk. And there are still signs up, and I find this amazing because I still remember seeing them this is now 27 years ago. Right around the Vatican, it's the brown arrow sign that says Villa Farnesina, pointing, because in the old days, that was part of the pilgrimage, right? You hit the Vatican, and then you'd walk down and visit the Farnesina afterwards. Since then, over the last 30 years or so, this painting has fallen into almost total anonymity and obscurity. I always ask my undergrads, many of whom are art history majors and many of whom love Renaissance art, how many of you are familiar with Raphael's Galatea? And every semester, fewer and fewer raise their hand. The French are frequent visitors to the Farnesina. Europeans love this place. Not too many Americans visit the Farnesina. It's not on that kind of fast track Rome type of tour. Point of all this and me telling you is that if you are in Rome anytime soon, God willing, we all will be sure to visit the Farnesina. This is just one of the most beautiful paintings in existence. And this is Raphael himself, the maestro, painting one of his most celebrated works on the walls of this pleasure palace of Agostino Chigi. And so this very beautiful figure of Galatea in the center of the scene, surrounded by all of these mythological creatures in a very kind of tableauish type of setting. In fact, when you look at it, it should remind you quite a bit of another celebrated mythological painting, which of course is the Birth of Venus. Did Raphael see this painting? Maybe, maybe not, but I find it amazing that two artists working some 30 years apart would paint such similar looking um, images when painting mythological subjects, right? And so here is Galatea in the center in this very strong contrapposto position. Again, that same kind of body type that we saw before in the loggia, her upper half turning to the right, her lower half turning to the left, her head looking up as well, giving us this dramatic sense of motion, this beautiful silky hair blowing in the wind as well. In fact, here's a detail up close of the figure. And look how ingenious Raphael actually is. The blue that you see here is the same blue of the water that you see behind, but surrounded by red, it sort of gives the impression of coming out at you, right? Of projecting towards us as hotter colors usually do. The red moves back and the blue sort of moves up, or the light blue moves up instead. The face, some people think inspired by Raphael's companion at the time, a woman by the name of Imperia. In fact, Raphael is celebrated as one of the few sort of philandering heterosexual artists of the day, and supposedly spent quite a few weekends at the villa in the company of his companion, and so perhaps immortalized her here on the wall. To the point, look, you can actually see the gloss and the moisture in her eyes. This is a fresco painting, everyone. And it's amazing to see how detailed Raphael could actually get, including the sheen. Look at that shine in her hair, which is just extraordinary. And then down below, this beautiful, just absolutely beautiful figure of Cupid hanging on for dear life there with the dolphin that you see, these kind of really mean looking dolphins. And so, again, the idea that just by default, mythological subject matter was a type of subject that we automatically associate with this notion of delectation, with fun, with hedonism, with these sorts of events. And clearly that's what's going on. And as Bonnie mentioned, this sort of pre-Valentine's Day theme, the story of Polyphemus and Galatea is one of the many examples of unrequited love. Right? You hear this theme very often in mythology, that is love shown from one person to another, but not reciprocated. And it's become a very common theme all night long because many other famous artworks were also celebrating this particular notion. All right, now we make our way upstairs to what is my favorite part of the Farnesina, because I'm an architectural historian. So I just absolutely adore the decoration here. We call this the Sala della Prospettiva, or the Hall of Perspective, where the architect Baldassare Peruzzi exercising this technique called quadratura. And what quadratura means is to create this illusionistic architectural extension, technically, right? In other words, this is all faux architecture painted on the walls, given the impression, technically, that the room is entirely open, that you could walk through and stand at the balustrade that you see there and admire the views of Rome all around. Now, the fresco is a little faded today, but you have to imagine that when this was first done, it must have been just absolutely striking to see such realistic architecture. And again, the illusion almost of a virtual reality that you could walk through the columns here. This is cutting edge stuff for the beginning of the 16th century to employ perspective in such a successful way. In fact, look over here to the left-hand side where you can even see the overlapping. So the impression is that you can kind of walk out here around and then eventually make your way all the way to this area as well. Absolutely unique expression of artwork. And the views that you actually see through the columns, here's a close-up, are the actual views that you would have seen beyond the walls. You follow? So the illusion was one that blended in perfectly with the actual surroundings of the building itself. And if you're reading here the graffiti, yes, the date of the graffiti is 1528. Right? This is the year after Rome was sacked by a German army, and many of those German soldiers slept inside of the Farnesina, and one of them decided to scribble on the walls in German, believe it or not. That is the graffiti that you see. And here's another example. And in fact, I remember looking at this for the first time and thinking how amazingly similar this looks to some of Cézanne paintings. Really amazing with these homes that you see representing the countryside surrounding the city of Rome. Right? And in fact, my favorite detail in the room is, excuse me, the figure of Minerva that you have here above the little niche. And you see this convex shield that she holds in her hand, and that shield actually reflects the room. You can see the coffered roof in the actual reflected surface. And so it really is just an exercise in sort of technical virtuosity in showing this off. And remember, we're upstairs. So the higher up now you are, the more private and sort of exclusive the space becomes, until finally you make your way through this door here to the right-hand side, which brings you to the most intimate of spaces, and that is the bedroom of Agostino Chigi, on the walls of which we have paintings by the artist Sodoma, right? And you actually see the same kind of, this is not the same artist who was painting in the other room, but this balustrade, clearly giving the impression that a visitor to the bedroom could walk up and through and into the painting, where we have Alexander the Great presenting the crown to Roxanne, the widow of Darius, who Alexander had just defeated. And presumably this is a portrait of Agostino Chigi's lover that you see extended on the bed. And the bed that's represented in the scene is an exact replica of the actual bed that was in the room. And we know this for a fact that the cost, it was so sumptuous, made of ivory and gold and the most expensive materials, that the cost of the bed was greater than the entire plot of land on which the villa was actually constructed. So literally living in the lap of luxury. This was the point of the building, and this was one of the great traditions revived by the banker Agostino Chigi at the beginning of the 16th century. Right? For the next major Renaissance pleasure palace, worth discussing, at least in my opinion, we fast forward an entire century to one of my favorite places on planet Earth, and that is the Villa Borghese. The building today, excuse me, is referred to as the Borghese Gallery. But remember, the Villa Borghese is in fact the building and the entire surrounding property, which serves the city of Rome like Central Park serves New York City. It is the great lung of Rome. And one of my favorite things to do is to walk up. You know, you can get here, you walk up to the top of the Via Veneto, and then you pass under the Porta Pinciana, part of the 3rd century Aurelian walls. And you're in this park. I mean, it's just mushroom pines everywhere, people rollerblading, skateboarding, riding bicycles, jogging, walking their dogs. And you make your way up this viale, and suddenly this building comes into view. And it's like like a mirage. I mean, it's almost hard to believe this cream colored structure appearing in the distance, and the artwork that's actually kept here. In my opinion, the greatest art collection in the world. And that, in fact, was the objective of the patron. This is what it looks like on the outside. This is the Great Hall. This is the first room into which you walk. And the reminder that I provide everyone who walks in is that when this was built, this was not meant to be experienced like a museum. It's not this systematic, okay, you look at this work of art, then you look at this work of art. The whole idea is that the artwork was creating atmosphere, was creating ambiance for the guests of the villa, so that you'd walk in at about dusk, right? That's usually when the events would take place. And when you came in, you're surrounded by all this art. The ceiling is decorated, the walls are decorated, the sculptures everywhere as well. You don't know where your eyes are supposed to go because they're not necessarily supposed to fall on one particular thing. The Borghese family, right? In fact, the owner of the structure was this gentleman, Pope Paul V Borghese, his real name, Camillo Borghese, described this structure as the theater of the universe. It was a place where all things, in fact, if you look at my virtual background, those little towers popping up were dovecotes. So imagine approaching and watching the white doves fly. There were silkworm farms. There were aviaries. There were secret and open gardens with rare plants and rare fruits as well. And this is the kind of place where if you were visiting Rome and you were fortunate enough to be hosted by Pope Paul V, you might be invited to spend the weekend or longer at his suburban villa, enjoying all these exotic things. There are letters written by Japanese ambassadors who were actually hosted by Pope Paul V at this structure and marveling at the beauty, marveling at the exotic and rarity of the objects that were actually kept there at the time. Now, I'm showing you the bust of Pope Paul V that's actually at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles because I like it better than the one that's actually at the Borghese, believe it or not. And it was carved by an artist we're going to discuss at length right now, whose name was Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Now, Paul V was the money behind the project, but the person responsible for putting the collection together is the one that you're looking at right here. Cardinal Scipione Borghese was essentially incaricato. He was given the responsibility by his papal uncle to put together the greatest art collection in the world. That was the objective. And Scipione Borghese, the guy you're looking at right now, came pretty close. And my favorite thing about the Borghese collection is it's not just the quality of the art, but it's the quantity. In other words, it's a digestible museum. You walk into it, you get a 2-hour block with which to view, during which time to view both floors of the actual building. And it's not overwhelming. This isn't the Vatican museums where you get dizzy. This isn't the Uffizi where you could spend a lifetime. It's just the perfect amount of art, and all of it is just of smashing quality. And in fact, it was Scipione who recognized the young budding talent of a technically Neapolitan sculptor, although his father was actually Florentine, by the name of Gian Lorenzo Bernini. And this is my favorite thing. And Bonnie and I have always had this great relationship because I love the mixing of the Renaissance with the modern, sort of putting two different artistic periods, chronologically at least, side by side. And that's exactly what Scipione Borghese was doing. Because you can see these are all ancient statues back there. But Gian Lorenzo Bernini was a very young contemporary artist. Let us not lose sight of that. And in fact, when he carved this image of Aeneas, the member of the junior royal branch of the ruling family of Troy, fleeing from Troy with his father, and Chysis up on his shoulder, Ascanius by his feet, Bernini may have been as young as 19. Right? For a long time, it was too difficult for us to believe that a 19-year-old kid could carve something of this extraordinary quality. So it was believed that this was actually carved by Gian Lorenzo's father, whose name is Pietro Bernini, who was a sculptor as well. And Gian Lorenzo simply contributed, but then we found the documentation that proved exclusive authorship of the sculpture by the 19-year-old Gian Lorenzo Bernini. And the degree of special effects in his sculptures is nothing less than incomprehensible. I mean, it's almost impossible to understand how we can achieve some of the detailing that you see. For instance, if you look up close here, look at the way Aeneas's fingers pulling on the skin underneath Anchizes's left leg, his fingertips here sinking into the flesh. Look at the sagging skin of the older Anchises here as we sort of look up, or the bulging there of the flesh under. Remember, folks, it is stone. If you were to punch this stuff, it would hurt your hand quite badly. Yet Bernini is able to transform it into flesh, which is an absolutely extraordinary thing. In fact, when you come up to the backside of the sculpture, what you see is that it's transformed into the sort of 3 ages of man, where we have the young child, Ascanius, then we have Aeneas in his prime, and for me, the most astounding illusion here is, in fact, the sort of sagging skin on the back of Anchises there up above. It is rock that Bernini is able to transform into white skin. I mean, it's just an amazing example of virtuosity. And if you think this is impressive, how about that piece? This is the one where people's jaw just sort of drops and their eyes look up in amazement, wondering how something like this could be made of stone. Gian Lorenzo Bernini's Apollo and Daphne. Right now, another story of unrequited love. Apollo, the god, maddened with love for a nymph by the name of Daphne. There's kind of a long story behind this because the reason he'd fallen in love was because Apollo had mocked Cupid. He saw Cupid sharpening his arrows, and Apollo teased him, saying that a boy should not be playing with a man's weapons. And Cupid had this revenge by striking Apollo with a sharp golden arrow that would make him fall in love with the first thing he saw. And he struck this poor nymph by the name of Daphne with a dull leaden arrow instead, made of lead. And that would cause her to reject the amorous advances of any man who made them. And they encounter each other. And Cupid takes a step towards her. Apollo takes a step towards her, excuse me. Daphne steps away. Apollo takes another step. She steps away. And then the chase begins. And of course, there's no way that she can outrun a god. And the moment that Apollo thinks he has her and embraces what he believes to be Daphne, she prays to her father, a river god by the name of Peneus, who saves his daughter by having her transformed into a laurel tree. And in fact, the story ends quite anticlimactically when Apollo says, "If you cannot be my love, then you shall be my tree." Try that one on Valentine's Day and see how it goes over. And so what Bernini does, and again, think about the story like the screenplay. He's the director, and he's now envisioning this scene with this chase between the god and the nymph. Right? And when you look at the bottom of it, and this is really the stuff that blows you away. Here is Apollo's sandaled right foot. Here are the roots that are beginning to grow from the toenails of Daphne. You see that? You're actually watching the metamorphosis, which is, by the way, the literary source for the story. It comes out of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Look at the laurel leaves beginning to form down here. And then from the side, and this is really my favorite aspect, is the juxtaposition of the effortless, emotionless face of Apollo. He is a god. He doesn't strain, he doesn't stress, he doesn't exert or what have you. And then the sheer desperation that you have of poor Daphne, whose fingers are transforming to twigs, which in turn extend to leaves. You see? In fact, one of my favorite stories I got straight from the mouth of a restorer who told me that when they were cleaning the statue, there was a massive comprehensive restoration that went on the building and all the stuff inside the building between 13 years, 1983 to 1984 to 1997, that when they were cleaning the statue, these leaves were chiming like crystal as they were cleaning them because they're so thin, right, that they were actually producing sound as they were being rubbed, which is extraordinary. Look at the curl right here, everyone. It is rock, it's stone, yet Bernini is able to transform it into something much more real than real. Right? And then here's that juxtaposition from down below. Look at that face, just almost indifference and desperation here. And then just these little details that Bernini includes, like the fact that his hand, Apollo's hand, never violates her skin. Okay, wherever he comes into contact, his flesh is buffered by that of the bark that you actually see. And so the idea that she is transformed magically, but ultimately her integrity remains intact. It's just an extraordinary expression of talent, of vision, of interpretation, of imagining the scene and transforming it into something that we can all admire. And remember, this is the original location. So the idea is you're at the party at the Pleasure Palace and you're walking around, you walk into this room, and it's better than music. It's visual music that Bernini is putting into the scene. And now this work, which is my favorite in the collection, was not originally in the building. This was given by the Borghese to another family named Ludovisi, but then later returned. But it just fits in perfectly with the general atmosphere of the Borghese. This is the story of Pluto and Persephone, another episode of unrequited love. Pluto, the god of the underworld, who was very enamored with this nymph called Persephone. And initially, he went through the proper channels. He approached his brother Zeus and said, "Look, I'm very fond of her. Do you think we may be able to arrange a wedding?" Zeus, or Jupiter by his Roman name, approaches Persephone's mom, says, look, my brother is very fond of your daughter. Do you think she might be interested in marrying him? And of course, Persephone's mother said, absolutely not. I will not have my daughter marrying someone who lives under the ground. And so there was an end to this attempt, but supposedly Pluto's desire got the better of him and finally decided to take matters into his own hands and to entrap Persephone. He knew she was particularly fond of flowers. And so the story goes that one day he lays out this giant narcissus flower, and when she stopped to admire it, the trap was sprung, this chasm opens up, Pluto comes out, grabs Persephone, and takes her down into the underworld with him. When she disappears, her mother falls into depression, and Ceres is the goddess of agriculture. So there is great famine upon the earth because nothing is growing. Jupiter realizes something must be done to fix this, and so he sends out the Olympian, I don't know, CIA or whoever it was he employed, and they actually find out that it was his brother who had kidnapped Persephone. So Jupiter says, you must give her up, and Pluto reluctantly does. But just as Persephone was leaving the underworld, she eats these pomegranate seeds. And if you eat the food of the underworld, then you must remain in the underworld, at least for a part of the year. And so the story goes that these pomegranate seeds would force her to spend half the year with Pluto in the underworld and the other half of the year with her mother on Earth. And this particular myth was the Greek explanation of the seasons, right? The cyclical seasons, technically speaking, where every spring Ceres is setting up the party. I mean, this great festivity for the return of her daughter, which is what we call springtime. And then, of course, in the fall, as she becomes more and more saddened by the fact that her daughter is going to disappear, things begin to die. And then winter, of course, is just abject depression with her daughter not around. It's a very beautiful myth. And again, Bernini now depicting it in physical form. And it really is just an extraordinary thing to see. Look at that lunging gesture on the part of Pluto. I love the little peekaboo game that Bernini plays as well, where he's not nude. Right? You have that drape hanging over his genitalia, but just that tuft of pubic hair that you see. So that little peekaboo, seeing and not seeing, which makes it even almost more erotic than if you were. And then his muscular body juxtaposed and counterbalanced by the softness, the plushness of her body instead. It's like, again, a dance, almost like Apollo and Daphne, kind of choreography that's going on. And then here you're looking up and you can see this sort of macabre kind of choreography as his right arm comes across, grabbing into her thigh. Look at the underarm here. I mean, this thing is just so staggeringly beautiful, yet he goes to the trouble of depicting underarm hair in the work. And then her left arm reacting, and you're seeing his skin pull back. That eye is distorted such to give the clear impression that, in fact, her hand is pushing the skin back. Ladies and gentlemen, it is stone. It is rock that you are looking at, but he's just turned it into skin and hair. And then the reaction, you can see his left arm coming all the way behind. Look at those fingers, this unconscious tension and kind of twitching in her extremities, which is just absolutely mind-boggling. But of course, the detail that gets everyone the hands, right? It really would not be difficult for me to convince you that this is actually just a black and white photograph of someone's hands embedded in the flesh of a human body. But it's not. These are marble hands that are embedded into the flesh of a marble body. And look at just the virtuosity of the indentation here of the fingertips, and then the fingers disappearing between the folds and the plies of her skin as well. It's just absolute brilliance, and using the physical to clearly represent the emotional and the spiritual, the story of love and the struggle for it as well. Right? And in fact, another of the artists that the Borghese were quite fond of was the great painter Caravaggio, who unfortunately for them, Pope Paul V was elected Pope in 1605, but he was never really able to exploit the talents of Caravaggio because in May of 1606, Caravaggio stabbed and killed a man in Rome and was wanted for murder and spent the next 4 years, the last 4 years of his life, on the run as a fugitive, right? Because in fact, the punishment for murder was capital, but the specific means of death that was assigned Caravaggio was beheading. And in fact, the Roman authorities said that if you spotted Caravaggio, you could enact the sentence on the spot. In other words, you were justified in cutting Caravaggio's head off. So rather violent sort of story. And in fact, some of Caravaggio's earliest works, like this one, the Sick Bacchus, which he probably painted while he was ill, in the home of a important cardinal by the name of Francesco Maria del Monte, and in fact, probably just passing the time using a mirror and painting himself. Not as Bacchus, actually. If you look carefully, these are not grape leaves; these are laurel leaves that you see up above. And in fact, he's depicting himself as a visual poet or a painter, because that's what a painter actually is. Because in the ancient world, poets were described as being pale and crowned with ivy, right? But you also see Caravaggio showing off his extraordinary ability to paint natura morta, right? The inventor, perhaps, of still life painting with the apricots and the grapes that you see there as well. Another celebrated painting by Caravaggio in the Borghese is the boy with the basket of fruit. In fact, these earlier works are those works that kind of stigmatize Caravaggio, excuse me, for many as a homoerotic style painter. Well, he wasn't. I mean, his early works are, but the reason is probably because of the tastes of his first patron. And what you have here is Caravaggio's boyfriend, whose name was Mario Miniti, who served as his model for many works. Looking at us solicitously with the dropping blouse and what have you, but ultimately just a prop for the real subject of the painting, which is this basket of fruit. And no other artist could reproduce reality with a degree of verisimilitude that Caravaggio could. But ultimately, this fruit is rotting. The leaves are decaying. This is not waxed fruit, that artists use today to exercise their skills. This is real stuff. And that's my favorite part of Caravaggio. For him, the beauty was imperfect, right? Because nature is not just this perfectly photoshopped, kind of plastic type of reality, but the fact that it is life, and life begins and goes through a cycle and then eventually comes to an end, as Caravaggio's eventually did. In fact, I'll spare you the interim, but Caravaggio actually did receive a pardon from the Pope, who owned the pleasure palace that we're in right now. And the price of his freedom was two paintings, one of which is the one that you're looking at right here. And it is a kind of double self-portrait. If you look at the face here of David, okay, and the meaning of the David and Goliath story, by the way, is that David represents humility, Goliath instead represents pride. And so this is a double self-portrait, Caravaggio as a young man and Caravaggio at the actual age at which he executed the painting. And so the message that he was delivering to the Pope is, look, I've cut off this head of pride, this violent, irreverent, drunkard, sociopathic head has been cut off, and I'm offering it to you in this gesture of contrition. Well, the painting did end up in the possession of the Pope, but Caravaggio died under rather mysterious circumstances instead before he ever returned to the city of Rome. But it's interesting. There are 6 of them actually in the Borghese. I'm not showing you all of them because there are too many. But consider that there are some 60 known paintings in the whole world by Caravaggio, a tenth of which are in one room of the Borghese. That's a pretty extraordinary statistic. And so if you think about the mix of the art and the artists and the different periods in history that are actually being depicted, all grouped together in a building whose prime purpose, again, was this notion of delectation, of having fun, right? Or not the reverence of the churches or what have you, but instead something completely different and something obviously, again, as Bonnie mentioned, appropriate for our upcoming celebration of Valentine's Day, because amorous affairs were, of course, one of the main objectives of all of these structures. Thank you, Bonnie. It's really always a pleasure